at Confluence Consulting and a riparian ecologist and a bunch of other good things. So, dad, skier, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Linda. Hello. It's good to have a Wetland Council meeting, and I've really enjoyed all the wonderful presentations this morning. My presentation is a little bit more about maybe focused on something that I deal with more on a daily basis with performance criteria and wetland mitigation sites, wetland restoration sites, and the inherent dynamic between trying to monitor things effectively, but from a performance standpoint, but then also from my client standpoint, doing it cost effectively. So it's really kind of this dynamic tension between these two things, and I don't have the answers. I don't have a silver bullet. I do have some ideas. I wanted to present this, though, today so that maybe in our conversations this afternoon that we would all start from the people that are in my and Amy's group would all start from kind of a common understanding, and then we could maybe build from there. So the way I've organized my talk is to first start off with a few kind of background information, because I know many of you are not involved with the regulatory aspects of wetlands. And then I want to talk about just what is ecological significance, what we should be monitoring for ecological significance, and then get into how we can improve efficiency of our monitoring, and then some ideas that I've come up with. But again, there's no definitive answers here. So some of the things that in our current performance criteria that have been, I guess, a bit annoying to me over the years throughout the Rocky Mountain region. It's not particular to Montana or Wyoming for that matter, but throughout the West is an overemphasis on primary productivity and vegetation parameters. And this kind of, I think, may have some relationship to stormwater BMPs, where to get that final sign-off on the stormwater permit, you have to have 70% cover. That's, makes a lot of sense, and I think that there is a place for vegetation parameters, but often there's this overemphasis on that. I think that in general there's a lack of any sort of acknowledgement of other ecologically important parameters. Is the site functioning as a sink for nutrients? What is the nutrient cycling that's occurring at the site? How is it connected to the rest of the landscape? Is there an increase in habitat diversity or resiliency to change and disturbance? And then some of the performance criteria require difficult methods that are complicated or are really laborious to implement, there's a lot of variability between the people that are doing the monitoring. And then some of the methods, particularly over the shorter time frames, don't have the sensitivity that we need to be able to document, okay, this is what's going on at the site. In the regulatory world, we're typically monitoring sites for 3 to 5 years. And so it's a relatively short time frame, and that's totally understandable. From my client's perspective, they don't want me out there more than I need to be. So their goal is to minimize the amount of time that I'm out there. And and then the question becomes, well, how many years should I be out there? You know, so there's that's kind of been a bit of, I guess, my frustrations. And so what I'm trying to do with this is just kind of trying to find what the balance is, and I'm hoping that brains in this room can help me figure it out. So just start off with a couple definitions. Performance standards are defined as standards of observable or measurable physical, chemical, or biological attributes that are used to determine if a compensatory mitigation project meets its objectives. And then the term practicable refers to something that is available and capable of being done after taking into consideration cost, existing technology, and logistics in light of overall project purposes. And then this is straight from the Code of Federal Regulations related to ecological performance standards. The first part of this I've broken down here, and it's basically saying that the performance standards need to relate specifically to the objectives, which makes sense. And that's because we want to determine if the site is developing into the desired resource type, providing the expected functions, and attaining any other applicable metrics. Pretty straightforward. The second paragraph in that first one says this, essentially, that performance standards must be objective and verifiable. Also says use the best available science. And it needs to be assessed in a practicable manner. So it's getting at that efficiency, that cost-benefit kind of analysis, or cost-benefit tension. The performance standards should be based on variables or measures of functional capacity described in functional assessment methodologies, measures of hydrology or other aquatic resource characteristics, and/or comparisons to reference aquatic resources of similar type and landscape position. In reality, that's kind of the theory, and I think it's great. In reality, there's also other factors that need to be considered, and not the least of which I don't even have up here, but site access. If the landscape is, in addition to that, if the landscape is set up for a wetland to develop, then there's likely already a wetland there. So how are we, as doing mitigation, how are we supposed to get our mitigation site in a similar landscape position as to what was as the reference site? The site potential of the mitigation site needs to be matched to the reference site for them to be really comparable. We need to account for temporal and spatial variability of what's going on within and surrounding the mitigation sites. And we need to acknowledge the limitations of the data that is being collected. I mean, Steve touched on this, Alden touched on this. There's limits, and the people that like that tech from Massachusetts or whatever that they're able to do, and how does that compare to something that Alden might collect? And that difference in just measurement is something that we need to worry about. And then just from a cost standpoint, if we're monitoring our mitigation site, and then we're also going out and monitoring a reference site for that mitigation site, then it just doubles the cost of that. And if we're looking at doing that for 5 years or longer, then the costs can really add up. So I'm going to kind of leave the performance standards behind for a minute and just start to talk a little bit about ecological significance. Now, it turns out that there's a group out there, the Convention of Biological Diversity, and they've defined these various traits that make up an ecologically significant site. an ecologically significant site can contain one or more of these. And I think that if you read through these, they start to really make sense. One thing that I'm going to add from a wetland perspective is that it can provide important functions. That might be another one to add here. And if this is just like for designated an important ecologically significant site. But if we start to look at wetland monitoring and wetland sites, then I think that these are really the most applicable for the discussion today. Those include the special importance for the life history stages of different species, biological productivity, biological diversity, and providing important functions. So if we could keep those in mind, just hold those in mind just for a minute. So if we then start to think about how can I monitor for ecological significance and do that in an efficient way, I think that there might be other questions, but these are some questions that I think would help us to kind of circle around and kind of wrap our mind around what that actually means. And the first and foremost is what are the ecological goals of the project? A lot of times we're trying to replace a wetland that was impacted, but I think that there might be other ecological goals, like we want to maybe provide more amphibian habitat, or we want to improve migration stopover locations, or improve winter roosting habitat, or there's other goals that we can come up with that are maybe more ecologically important than just saying, oh, we're just replacing this one wetland. And so then the next question might be, well, what is a reasonable level of effort for monitoring? And I just threw this question out there. Should we look at overall cost of mitigation action versus the permitting and monitoring costs? So should monitoring make up 10% of the overall project cost? Should it make up 25% of the whole overall project cost? At what point is monitoring becoming too much? So that's actually a really interesting question to me. But you hear all these rules of thumb. Oh yeah, construction oversight for restoration projects should be between 10 and 15% of the overall construction costs. Well, I don't know where that came from, but that's bandied around like it's the Bible or something. And I'm just kind of wondering, well, can we come up with a rule of thumb for permitting and monitoring costs? What ecological parameters and how frequently can they be monitored within that level of effort? So whatever level of effort we decide is reasonable, what can we do within that? And then what are the most efficient methods to assess the ecological parameters? And I had kind of a beginning of a conversation with Jay about this, just how can drones and remote sensing technology, or pressure transducers, data loggers, that sort of thing, how can they be used to help us be more efficient and reduce costs? So I want to go back. These were the ecological goals, and I want to kind of focus on that a little bit more and bring in the 4 elements of the that are more ecologically significant related to wetlands and for wetland monitoring. And I'm going to start with special importance of species life history. So this is I think actually may end up being transformational in how we look at monitoring for compensatory mitigation sites, and it relates to how species actually use the site. So I'm gonna and there's different ways to think about this. There's from a species level, seasonal, whether it's migrational, physiological, if it's maybe getting sage grouse, chicks, just hatch. They first go to ephemeral wetland areas where there's more bugs, and they start feeding. So it might be physiological, it might be developmental, reproductive, some sort of nesting or breeding behaviors, so there's all these different ways that animals use the sites. And this really came home to me at a site that I'm working on right now in western Montana called the Foul Slough. It's kind of a backwater of the Flathead River. And in the winter, it's a winter roosting site kind of near Nine Pipes, where it's a warm water spring, and there's literally tens of thousands of waterfowl. It's a full third of the, estimated to be a full third of the winter, overwintering population of waterfowl in the state hangs out at Foul Slough. And so, as you can see, in the winter, this is just a crazy, crazy place. And then you look at it in June of that same year, and there's not a duck on the damn slough at all. And then you look at it last October after it had been grazed, and it's a completely different place. So if we didn't know about how important it was for those waterfowl in the winter, and I went there in June or in October even, when we were out there on this day, I think I saw 2 ducks. And this is probably maybe a month or a month and a half before it really starts to get that really heavy use, which it gets for 2 or 3 months. So at this site, monitoring would actually be, this is a super significant site, but if I were to monitor it in June of the year, I might not really understand that. And I would completely miss that. And I'd be measuring, maybe plant cover or something, and it wouldn't capture, the actual significance of this site to species in the OES area. So, the timing of use also, and the habitat is interspersion, food chain support, habitat diversity, all affect biological productivity, which is another one of those ecologically significant factors. These are also, well, I guess I've created this little diagram that just kind of emphasizes the landscape setting and how these systems are not operating in isolation. They're connected. The animals are, oh, I'm going to go to McDonald's today. Oh, tomorrow, oh, I feel like going to Wendy's, or whatever. They're going to different places for different reasons and different things. So the landscape setting, I think, is another aspect of this in determining performance criteria that we should be looking at. Biological diversity, similar things. Timing of use, habitat diversity affected. We might be able to start looking at biological diversity by looking at the floristic quality assessment, and that's a vegetation parameter, but is getting at that diversity aspect. I was really interested in Steve's presentation and his rapidization of that method, which is pretty awesome. And looking at reference wetlands or reference standards that are developed from reference wetlands, I think is a really interesting line of inquiry. Soil bacteria actually is something that could probably be easily collected and sent off to a lab really quickly, and is actually becoming increasingly, we're starting to understand just how important it is for the nutrient cycling that's occurring on a site. So that could be something that is adapted. And then eDNA, eDNA has been something that I've been trying to get involved with for a while, but just haven't been able to. On the ride over, Andy was telling me that they're actually collecting eDNA samples and using it to, they're analyzing it for not just amphibian species, but for all species that they have sequences for. So grizzly bears, wolves, elk, and they're able to get an idea of what has been using the site. So that might be a way, again, this kind of technology aspect of quickly, efficiently kind of documenting, what's using it and how significant the site really is. If you think about it, I've monitored lots of different mitigation sites for MDT over the years. And I'll get up in the morning, I'll leave my house by 6 or something, maybe 5, drive for a couple hours, get to the site around 8 or 9, and for a lot of species, I'll work from 9 until 3 or 4, collect all my data and everything, and then I'll leave and go home. Well, between 9 and 4, most of the species that are probably going to use that site are probably there at 6, in the summer months, 6 to 8 maybe, and maybe at at nightfall at between 8 and 10 o'clock at night. So I'm not catching that at all. I'm out there and there's nothing out there. The only evidence that I have that something was there is if they went to the bathroom or they made a track in some mud. So anyway, it's eDNA could change the way we monitor. And then functions. This is something that's near and dear to my heart, and something that we try and incorporate into our mitigation sites. And I'll just mention that on the MWAM, there's a column in the final table, the scoring table at the end, where it asks you to identify like the 4 most important functions for the site. And a lot of people will just say, oh, well, this is rated 1. Let's say you have a sensitive S1 species, and it's rated 1, so that it must be the most important function, that for the state-sensitive species. Well, that may or may not be the case. There's often where I think, and especially like in an urban environment, where water quality improvement is way more important than that. And that's the function, even though it might only be rated at a 0.6 or 0.5 or something, that I think is actually what this site is contributing most to, from a functional perspective to society. So that's why I might, select a different one. Other than that. So it's an opportunity to really look at that. And so then when you're actually going out and doing your mitigation, and if you've documented those 4 most important sites or 4 most important functions of the impact wetland, then you would be able to target those in your mitigation site. And then, I've talked about this with some of you in the past. There's been efforts, particularly Brad Johnson and others in Colorado, working on wetland profiling. This is where you actually go out into a watershed, you classify all the wetlands into their appropriate HGM classification, and then assign functions to those based on what type they are. So like a slope wetland would have its suite of functions. Floodplain or riverine wetlands would have its suite of functions. And you can start to look at these different functions and then look at impacts to the functions or to the wetlands and the types of wetlands and come up with, okay, this is what we've lost. And this is, on the whole watershed basis. And so this is what we should actually be targeting for functions to replace when we're trying to compensate for that. This takes a lot of investment, but it certainly makes a lot of sense to me. And you can also look at it as far as like, this is what we've lost. This is the projection of where development is going in the watershed, and so these are the types of functions that we will need. And so you can also adjust it, based on that. Kind of like a desired future condition or something. I don't have no idea how much time I've used.
So I was listening and not paying attention.
I end up talking a lot, so. So, just to kind of circle back, how, considerations, how frequently should these sites be monitored? Can we do different levels of monitoring and still achieve the same outcomes? What is the best time of year? You could change that to the best time of day to capture ecologically significant parameters for a particular site. I gotta say that the Corps, Nathan in particular, has worked with me on this one here in employing different levels of monitoring. So we're not at one particular site, we're not monitoring we're not doing a delineation every year, we're just doing it kind of like at the end, which is appreciated. So there's just that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about there. So here's just a couple of examples. I'm not holding these up as being like the gold standard or anything, but this is one way of displaying this type of information where we're linking the goal, the objective to the performance metrics, the method, and then the time frame that is completed. And in this case, it's more of a physical kind of approach with bankful flows and then the wetland hydrology. This is one where we're using the floristic quality assessment. You can see here we're using Daubenmeier quads. This is an approach trying to, instead of those 10-meter quadrats, those are just killers, 6 hours worth of time. So we were using more of a repeatable but more, more streamlined approach. This is getting at diversity, structural diversity, and looking at diversity H classes, which is a nice thing. And then you notice the time frame is pushed out a bit because this stuff can take longer to change than just within the 5 years. This is one where we used the Heritage Program data to help us, and we used the Great Plains closed depression wetland information to develop this, and with an eye towards achieving a similar level of species diversity. So I'm getting close to so wrapping it up, the objective and quantifiable, that's already kind of captured, but that's very important. I got to say that just based on years of monitoring and working with different methods and different people, that keeping it simple is really important. That's not always possible, but it definitely leads to more consistent and repeatable results. I'm suggesting that we identify goals that address species-specific uses, that we start looking more at mitigation within the 10 and 12 unit HUC codes, and from like a food chain support and productivity standpoint, looking more at biological diversity and how the site is contributing to that landscape level biological diversity, and then specific functions that are desired or that were impacted. And then to target specific times, seasons of use, or function. So I'll let you read all these. At the end, though, really for any of this to really work, we need you guys to give credit for these ecological parameters. And, a lot of times we're caught up with metrics that we can measure, like acres and percent cover, that sort of thing. And how do you quantify? Oh, this is used by 10,000 ducks. And what is that? Like, how do you even start to put a way of developing a credit for that? Like, it's, if you go from if you're creating a site and it goes from 0 ducks to 10 ducks, what credit do you get for that? You see what I mean? But that's the sort of thing that it would be really nice to work through and come up with, because I think that we could really improve our ecological measurements, or ecological impact on the landscape, if we got credit for it. So that's all I had.
We're going to thank you, and then we'll do the questions in the groups.
Okay.